Athens, 399 before Christ. A 70-year-old man walks barefoot toward his own death. His hands do not tremble, his voice does not waver. While his disciples weep around him, he smiles, not out of insanity, but from a conviction so profound that it transformed his own condemnation into victory. This man is Socrates, and in this moment, facing the cup of hemlock that will end his life, he is about to teach us the most powerful lesson in the history of philosophy: how moral coherence and self-knowledge can free someone even from death itself. What makes a human being prefer to die rather than betray their principles? How is it possible to maintain serenity when everything is lost? Today you will discover the secret that Socrates carried and that saved not his life, but something far greater, his soul. This is the story of how one man defeated his accusers without uttering a single lie. Prepare yourself for a journey to the heart of ancient wisdom, where every word echoes to this day. To understand Socrates, we first need to see Athens, not as the idealized city from books, but as it truly was: complex, contradictory, and seething with passions. In the 5th century before Christ, Athens was the center of the known world, birthplace of democracy, the arts, theater, and philosophy. But it was also a city of endless wars, political conspiracies, and profound social instability. Socrates was born around the year 470 before Christ, son of a sculptor and a midwife. Nothing in his origins suggested greatness. He grew up amid the splendor of Pericles, witnessed the construction of the Parthenon, but also lived through the scars of the Peloponnesian War, a devastating conflict that brought Athens to its knees before Sparta. And Socrates? He was strange, ugly according to his own contemporaries. Flat nose, bulging eyes, protruding belly. He dressed poorly. He walked barefoot through the streets. He never wrote a single line. He charged nothing for his teachings. He didn't fit in. But he had something others didn't: a tireless curiosity for truth. He spent his days in public squares, in academies, in markets, always asking questions. Questions that bothered people. Questions that disarmed them. What is justice? He would ask politicians. What is courage? He questioned generals. What is virtue? He inquired of the youth. And here is the crucial point. Socrates didn't ask these questions to humiliate anyone. He asked them because he deeply believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, that no one can act correctly without first knowing themselves. That wisdom begins precisely when we recognize our own ignorance. For Socrates, self-knowledge wasn't a philosophical luxury. It was a matter of moral survival. But Athens was changing. Democracy was becoming volatile, emotional, dangerous. The city that celebrated freedom of speech was also capable of condemning to death those who spoke too much. And Socrates spoke. Always. Year 399 before Christ. Socrates, now 70 years old, is dragged to court. The charges: corrupting the youth and not believing in the city's gods. In other words, being dangerous. But what was really happening? Athens had just emerged from a brutal civil war. Democracy had been restored, but fear and paranoia still dominated. Socrates, with his uncomfortable questions, had become the perfect scapegoat. He was associated with some of the city's most hated traitors, his students, like Alcibiades and Critias, who had betrayed Athens. It didn't matter that Socrates had never taught treason. His presence, his voice, his irritating method of exposing others' ignorance, all of it had become unbearable. And then came the trial. 501 Athenian jurors gathered to decide his fate. Socrates could have defended himself with tears, pleas, emotional appeals, as was common. He could have brought his wife, Xanthippe, and his 3 young children to arouse pity. He could have feigned repentance, but he did none of that. Instead, Socrates did something extraordinary. He transformed his defense into an act of teaching. He did not beg for mercy. He explained with disconcerting calmness why his mission, to question, to investigate, to seek truth, was in fact a service to the city. He said that Athens needed him like a lazy horse needs a gadfly to be awakened, that he was a gift from the gods, that condemning him would be condemning the city's own conscience. The jurors were astonished, some furious, others moved. But the majority voted for conviction. By a small margin, 280 against 221, Socrates was found guilty. And then came the second phase, determining the penalty. His accusers demanded death. Socrates could have proposed exile, a heavy fine, eternal silence. But he didn't do that. With cutting irony, Socrates suggested that instead of being punished, he should be rewarded, that the city should support him for the rest of his life, as it did with Olympic heroes. The provocation was too much. The margin of votes for the death penalty increased. Now it was 360 against 141. Socrates had sealed his own fate. But in his eyes, he had done something far more important. Preserved his integrity. He would not bow, would not lie, would not betray himself. What Socrates did in that courtroom wasn't madness. It was the ultimate expression of a principle he had cultivated throughout his life: absolute moral coherence. For Socrates, there was no point in living a long life if that life was built on lies, betrayals, or cowardice. Better to die standing than to live on your knees. But attention, this wasn't fanaticism, it was applied philosophy. Socrates deeply believed that self-knowledge, knowing who you really are, what you value, what you stand for, is the only way to live an authentic life. And an authentic life for him was the only life worth living. He taught that we all have an inner voice, what he called the daimon, a kind of conscience that alerts us when we're about to do something wrong. This voice doesn't shout, doesn't condemn, but whispers. And Socrates spent his entire life listening to that whisper. He knew that betraying his principles to save his own skin would be worse than death, because death only ends the body. But betrayal, it corrupts the soul. And the soul for Socrates was eternal. Here's the deepest point. Socrates didn't see death as an enemy. He saw ignorance as the true evil. He said that no one does evil intentionally, only from not knowing good. That all wrong actions come from ignorance about ourselves and the world. So if you truly know yourself, if you know what is right, what is just, what is good, you cannot act against it, not without destroying yourself. That's why Socrates chose to die, not out of stubbornness, but because living while betraying his principles would be like erasing his own identity. It would mean ceasing to be Socrates, and that for him was worse than any hemlock. Think about this for a moment. How many times do we betray ourselves? How many times do we say yes when we want to say no? How many times do we accept injustices out of fear, convenience, or social pressure? Socrates shows us that true freedom doesn't come from being alive. It comes from being aligned with who you really are. Now you might be thinking, that's beautiful, but I'm not Socrates. I have bills to pay. I have responsibilities. I can't just die for my principles. And you're right. Most of us won't face an Athenian court. But all of us face every day small trials, small choices between what's right and what's convenient, between truth and acceptance, between being ourselves or being what others expect. And that's where Socrates becomes relevant. We're not talking about martyrdom. We're talking about daily coherence, about small decisions that, added together, define who you are. Imagine you're in a work meeting. Everyone agrees with the decision you know is wrong, unjust, unethical, or simply stupid. What do? Stay silent to avoid problems? Or do you speak up, even knowing you might be excluded? Socrates isn't asking you to be sacrificed. He's asking you to question yourself. What do I lose by staying silent? Do I only lose others' approval? Or do I lose something of myself? Or think of another situation. You're in a relationship where you have to pretend to be someone you're not to keep the peace. You hide your values, your opinions, your dreams. Socrates would ask, who is loving whom? If you have to lie about who you are, is that love even real? Socratic self-knowledge isn't selfishness. It's radical honesty. It's knowing what you value and having the courage to live according to it, even when it hurts, even when it costs dearly, because the alternative, living a misaligned life, betraying yourself bit by bit, is a slow-motion death. Socrates also teaches us about the importance of doubt. He never claimed to know everything. In fact, he said his only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing, and that's liberating. Because when you stop pretending you have all the answers, you open yourself to true learning. You allow yourself to be questioned. You allow yourself to grow. Today we live in an era of loud certainties. Everyone has an opinion about everything. But how many of us actually stop to question our own beliefs, to ask, why do I believe this? Is this really mine, or is it something I absorbed without thinking? Socrates invites us on this journey to look inward, to recognize our contradictions, to have the humility to admit we might be wrong, and from there build an authentic life, a life that isn't perfect but is yours, a life that in the end you can look in the eye and say, I lived according to what I believe. I was myself. And that, my friend, that is freedom. Socrates never wrote a single word, and yet 24 centuries later, here we are talking about him, thinking about him, learning from him. How is this possible? Because Socrates understood something most people forget. The legacy of a life isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you represent. It isn't in what you say, but in what you do. It isn't in the duration of your existence, but in the depth of your coherence. After being convicted, Socrates spent 30 days in prison. His friends planned his escape. It was easy, simple, safe. But Socrates refused. He explained with infinite patience that escaping would be betraying the city's laws, that he had lived under those laws for 70 years, that accepting their protections and then rejecting them when convenient would be hypocrisy. Some of his disciples didn't understand. They thought he was being stubborn, inflexible. But Socrates knew what they didn't, that the true battle wasn't against the Athenians. It was against his own inner weakness. It was against the fear that whispered, save yourself, you deserve to live. And Socrates responded to that fear with a devastating truth. I deserve to live with dignity, and there is no dignity in betraying myself. On the last day, he gathered his disciples, washed himself, said goodbye to his wife and children with disconcerting serenity, and then, with steady hands, drank the hemlock. He walked around the cell until his legs began to feel heavy. He lay down, covered his face, and his last words were, Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius, pay that debt, and don't forget. A rooster, a common sacrifice to the gods of healing. Socrates was saying between the lines that death wasn't a tragedy. It was a cure, a liberation from the prison of the body and the injustices of the world. And then he died. But here's the miracle. By dying, Socrates won. His accusers disappeared into obscurity. His jurors were forgotten. But Socrates? Socrates became immortal, not because he lived longer, but because he lived better, because he taught with his own life that the true victory isn't escaping death. It's having nothing to regret when it arrives. It's looking back and seeing an entire life built on truth. It's knowing that, in the end, you were faithful to yourself. So, here we are, in the 21st century, in a radically different world. No hemlock, no Athenian courts, no togas and agoras, but with the same dilemmas, with the same temptations, with the same fundamental choice that Socrates faced. Live according to truth or live according to convenience. Socrates left us a gift, not ready-made answers, but eternal questions. Who am I? What do I value? Am I living according to that? And the most important, if I had to die tomorrow, would I be at peace with the life I've lived? These questions aren't easy. They're uncomfortable. They require courage. They require brutal honesty. But they're the only questions that matter. Because in the end, and the end always comes, what remains isn't what you accumulated. It isn't how many people applauded you. It isn't how many battles you won. What remains is who you were. Whether you were authentic, whether you were courageous, whether you were faithful to your principles, even when the whole world told you to give up. Socrates wasn't saved from death, but he was saved from something worse. Life without meaning, empty existence, betrayal of himself. And that, my friends, is the wisdom that saved Socrates, not from dying, but from dying in vain. Now I leave you with a question that Socrates would ask if he were here. And I want you to reflect deeply on it. Maybe even leave your answer in the comments. The question is this: if you knew your life would end tomorrow, would there be something you'd regret not having done? Not from fear of death, but from fear of not having been yourself? Think about it. Live it. And remember, the unexamined life is not worth living. But the life lived with truth, that one is eternal. Thank you for watching. And until the next journey through wisdom that transcends the centuries,